This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Boy.
Tonight, America pays tribute to one of the giants of journalism.
He was a kind, caring man with a razor-sharp mind and an unquenchable desire to know things.
I think we all owe Walter a great debt.
And that's the way it is, Friday.
Remembering Walter Cronkite, the way it was.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
Good evening, everyone. Say the name Walter Cronkite, and for so many people, the memories come flooding back. That's what happened today as the death of our CBS colleague made headlines all over the country. Memories of decades of the biggest news stories and of the man who brought them to us. His nightly broadcast was appointment television in millions of homes. We didn't just watch the news, we watched Walter Cronkite as he became our trusted guide through history.
And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is.
That's the way it is.
For half a century, Walter Cronkite told it the way it was, delivering the news straight and unvarnished.
Evening, everyone. Here is the news.
Among the pioneers who built television news from the ground up, he forged a special bond with audiences. Trustworthy, plain-spoken, unflappable.
And you were there.
Walter was there. He had lived the history of the century and reported it. Born in 1916 in St. Joseph, Missouri. As a young man growing up in Houston and Kansas City, he saw firsthand the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and the Great Depression. As a young wire service reporter in World War II, he hit the ground with troops in North Africa and was the first to make it back with the story.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war.
He was all of 26, a natural, before the camera and the microphone. In the early 1950s, television came calling. Walter anchored the news on CBS, first in Washington, then on the network from New York. As television began taking wing in the 1950s, so did Walter, covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth.
She's to be crowned Britain's 6th reigning queen.
An atomic device.
Atom bomb testing in Nevada, the birth of the American space program.
Fire at the apogee to raise the perigee.
Walter knew 12 American presidents.
I've met all of America's presidents since Herbert Hoover, and I've known some of them pretty well. Lyndon Johnson called the CBS Evening News while I was actually on the air and insisted that they put him through to me on the air. The secretary said, but he's on the air, Mr. President. I don't give a damn where he is. Put him on the phone.
He assumed the anchor chair of the evening news in 1962.
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
Walter Cronkite was the man that most Americans turned to find out what was happening, to be comforted in times of stress, to be reassured that as bad as things might be, there was a feeling of continuity. He provided that continuity 5 nights a week.
Supreme Court today legalized abortion.
A flurry of activity at the Jack Ruby trial.
The risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant.
And he was with us during America's darkest moments.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And I almost lost it there.
His authority and his calmness held the nation together. Not forget CBS News. He held the nation together during critical times.
Cronkite was a fixture at political conventions, including the Democrats' chaotic meeting in Chicago in 1968, a party in a country at war with itself over Vietnam. Walter's skepticism grew while reporting on the Vietnam War. He shared those feelings in a landmark broadcast in which he acknowledged he was stating his opinion that it was time for the nation to withdraw.
But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors,
but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
After that report, I recall that LBJ said to many of us that if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war.
In the 60s and the 70s, when the shingles were flying off of America's roof and everything was coming loose, you really needed a voice of calm and professionalism and accuracy. And America got that on the evening news with Walter Cronkite.
Countdown is at 2 minutes.
But his personal passion was space.
I think that our conquest of space will probably be the most important story of the whole 20th century.
Looks like a good flight. Oh, go, baby.
In 1969, a waiting world held its breath as man first approached the surface of the moon.
The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
Oh, boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. For me, it's a moment for which I long have planned, but which nevertheless comes with some sadness.
His own spirit was unconquerable. After leaving the evening news, he traveled well into his 80s, making documentaries and enjoying himself. In 1996, he told us how he felt about the amazing century he had witnessed.
If there's anything I've learned, it is that we Americans do have a way of rising to the challenges that confront us. Just when it seems we're most divided, we suddenly show our remarkable solidarity. The 20th century may be leaving us with a host of problems, but I've also noted that it does seem darkest before the dawn. There's reason to hope for the 21st century, and that's the way it will be.
President Obama, who was just an infant when Walter Cronkite began anchoring this broadcast, is leading the nation in paying tribute to him.
For decades, Walter Cronkite was the most trusted voice in America. His rich baritone reached millions of living rooms every night. And in an industry of icons, Walter set the standard by which all others have been judged. He was there through wars and riots, marches and milestones, calmly telling us what we needed to know. And through it all, he never lost the integrity he gained growing up in the heartland.
Also honoring Walter Cronkite is another president, Bill Clinton. Earlier today, I asked him what he remembered most about Walter.
My earliest memories, I think, are of the 1960s, the Kennedy years. I remember when CBS went from a 15-minute to a 30-minute news program. We discussed it in my house. I remember he did an interview with President Kennedy. And then, of course, I remember his gripping commentary when the president was killed. We kept the television on to Walter Cronkite the whole time. We wanted to see what he had to say.
What was your relationship with him like?
Well, it was good. I got to know him after I became president because we both spent some time in the summer in Martha's Vineyard. And we started going to a number of parties together. And then in 1998, when I was there, he called me one day and invited Hillary and Chelsea and me to go sailing with him and with Betsy. And we had the most wonderful day. It was a kind and generous thing to do. And we went out together. And he was then, I think, 81. And already he was still a great sailor. And we really struck up a friendship. He was what he seemed to be. He was a kind, caring man with a razor-sharp mind and an unquenchable desire to know things. And he had a very high standard. When he said something, he believed it to be true.
What are the qualities that stand out to you personally that made Walter Cronkite such a venerated American, such an icon?
First, I think people could identify with him. He seemed accessible and open. You never thought he was trying to spin you. You never had the feeling that there was a storyline with Walter Cronkite, that he just looked at the facts, did his best to find out what was going on, and then told them to you. It made him incredibly trusted, and that's a very valuable commodity.
Do you think you've ever seen someone celebrated and remembered with such respect and reverence?
Not in the media, really. And I say that not because there aren't other media people worthy of respect, even reverence, but I think that it's important. He came into television news when it was young. It was a momentous time in America in the 60s and 70s, lots of things going on, lots of real raw news to report.
President Clinton, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing your memories of Walter Cronkite tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. As I said, he was a great citizen, but he was also a profoundly good man. I don't think we should lose sight of that. All those professional gifts emanated from a very good core, and that's something that's beyond training. It's just who he was.
Very well said. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And when we come back, Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin remembers Walter Cronkite.
Hello, everyone. Here we are again in Studio A, our CBS television control point for the Westinghouse coverage, this time of the Democratic National Convention.
A broadcasting legend, an American icon, the biggest names in politics, news, and entertainment, remembering Walter Cronkite tomorrow.
Walter Cronkite died just 3 days before the 40th anniversary of the first manned landing on the moon, July 20th, 1969. He was the Apollo 11 mission's biggest fan, and he wasn't afraid to let his enthusiasm show.
Never has there been before, nor will there be, anything like this pioneering adventure. The landing on the moon presented an interesting emotional challenge for me. I had just as much time to prepare for that landing as the space program did.
30 seconds.
I'd watched it from the beginning.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Oh, boy. And yet, when that vehicle landed on the moon, I was speechless.
Boy.
I really couldn't say a thing.
Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American standing on the surface of the moon.
I mean, at a time when there were a lot of other problems in this country and elsewhere, people were downcast. Everybody there was upcast. We were looking toward the stars, looking toward the moon.
Edwin Buzz Aldrin was Neil Armstrong's moonwalking partner 40 years ago. He joins us now. Buzz Aldrin, nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to be with you, Katie.
NASA released a statement. In it, it said, from the earliest days of the space program, Walter brought the excitement, the drama, and the achievements of spaceflight directly into our homes. He obviously generated a lot of excitement, Buzz, for the program. Do you think NASA, in a way, owes Walter Cronkite a debt of gratitude for sharing his enthusiasm with the American public?
I think we all owe Walter a great debt. And I think Walter was trying to cash in on that a little bit in the Journalist in Space program. Unfortunately, after the Challenger accident that took Christa McAuliffe, those programs were terminated.
Would you have liked to have seen Walter Cronkite go up in space? Because it was one of his dreams.
I would have loved to have seen him get in that shuttle and go up there and be a part of reminiscing about what spaceflight is really about in the golden words that only Walter Cronkite knew how to communicate to all of people around the world.
Buzz Aldrin, thank you very much. And we'll be back right after this.
To ensure man's survival in the hostile environment of outer space.
Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American standing on the surface of the moon.
Since I grew up, I remember he was the news for so long.
He's middle America all these years. He wasn't right, he wasn't left. He was news, and he was straight on, and he was heroic.
Back now with our special coverage, Remembering Walter Cronkite. Leslie Moonves is the president and CEO of CBS, and Morley Safer of 60 Minutes has been a CBS News correspondent since 1964. Morley, let me start with you. You've said that Walter was a wonderful person to have at the helm for correspondents out in the field. How did he support all those reporters covering the world when he was the anchor?
Well, he was extremely supportive, as you say, and he was also a very tough editor. And I think the combination of that made you work even harder. You wanted to be not just right, you wanted to nail every story. But he also acted, how can I say this politely, as a kind of buffer, as a friend in court, a buffer between you and the brass. Les, you're the brass.
You covered Vietnam with Walter, and he went to the front lines to talk with the troops on a number of occasions. Did he morally grapple with his decision to come out publicly against the war in 1968?
I think he sweated that out for a long time. But ultimately, what he did, what he said, was really on so many Americans' minds at that point. And not just voters, but elected officials and senior military people.
Les, what do you think Walter Cronkite meant to the evolution of TV news and to the institution of CBS News in particular?
I think anybody on the air today owes a deep debt of gratitude to him, what he stood for, how he handled the chair. There was no secret that he was the most trusted man in America, and there was a reason for that. I think the legacy of CBS, it is so important because everybody remembers Walter Cronkite as being synonymous with the name CBS. He represented the best that we are as news reporters and the best that we are as a network.
Les, in many ways, he was the antithesis of sort of the blow-dried anchor who makes his or her way through the ranks of local news. If a young Walter Cronkite walked into your office today, do you think you would hire him?
I sure hope so. What stood out about him was his honesty, his integrity. He represented all of us, and I think that's what made him so trusted and so successful, and I would hope if a young Walter Cronkite walked in the door, I would hire him.
Les Moonves and Morley Safer, thank you both so much. And coming up next, the Beatles, where it all began, and it's not where you may think. Former Beatle Paul McCartney took the stage last night at New York City Field, the new home of the Mets. That ballpark is the successor to Shea Stadium, where John, Paul, George, and Ringo performed in 1965, which ushered in the era of stadium concerts. Most people think the Beatles made their American television debut on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, but Walter Cronkite, a real stickler for accuracy, always wanted people to know it actually happened on this broadcast in 1963. Beatlemania was well underway in the UK.
We were offered a piece by a London bureau of this phenomenon, so we put it on the air one night.
That night was December 10th, 1963.
And meanwhile, yeah, the fan mail keeps rolling in, and so does the money.
They have sold 2.5 million records. They lead the hit parade.
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really. You know, as you say, the haircuts.
Despite the hysteria of their mostly female fans, it wasn't clear then just how long the Beatles' success would last.
Do you have any fears that your public eventually will get tired of you and move on to a new favorite?
Well, they probably will, but, you know...
You ever think about
Depends how long it takes for them to get tired.
Ed Sullivan was watching that story, and right after the newscast, he called Walter Cronkite.
We were good friends, and Ed said, Walter, tell me about those kids. Tell me about those kids. What kids, Ed? You know, those kids you just had on the air. What do you call them, the buggers or the Beatles or something?
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
That performance came 2 months after their debut on the CBS Evening News.
We just hoped we are going to have quite a run.
And they did, with a little help from Walter Cronkite.
If there's some credit in history for that, I want it.
And that is the CBS Evening News for tonight. There will be more about Walter Cronkite on a CBS News special tomorrow evening at 7, 6 Central. I'm Katie Couric. Russ Mitchell will be here tomorrow. I'll see you back here on Monday. Good night.
CBS News is very good news.